Or again, there's an increasingly popular notion among some Christians today. A notion that sprang up in the 19th century and has more recently been made popular by the fictional Left Behind series. A notion of something called the rapture, a grand, dramatic, divine rescue of certain Christians, only the born-again kind, so that they will not have to go through trials and tribulations and suffering at the end of time. The rapture is a notion based on taking several biblical texts out of their historical context and turning what was originally a message of hope for early Christians who actually were going through the trials and tribulations and suffering of persecution, of taking that message of hope and turning it into some literal prophecy of an end time where only those who are certain kinds of Christians will be taken out of the world, away from trials and sufferings and tribulation. As the Lutheran scholar Barbara R. Rossing says in chapter 1 of what is a fairly new book, The Rapture Exposed, in talking about the Left Behind series, which some people have taken not as a work of fiction, but as the literal truth. She says, and I quote, "Sadly, what gets left behind by the rapture plotline is the Bible itself." Because as she goes on to point out, the overriding message of the Bible is not that God takes people out of the world, but that God stays with us on earth and walks through every trial. To make her point even more, she quotes the 19th century former slave Sojourner Truth, who was actually a very incredible theologian. Sojourner Truth was writing against this very idea in that 19th century when it was just beginning to come up and take form. And she said this. She said, "God's people experience trials and tribulations," and let me tell you, as a former slave, she knew that. She goes on to say, "The message of the Bible is that God comes to dwell with us and walk with us through all the events of our life." You see, Jesus doesn't lead us out of the trials, not out of the trials and tribulations and sufferings. That's not the message of the cross and the resurrection. That message that we remember during the 40 days of Lent is that Jesus leads us right through them, and it is in going through them that we come to that other side. You know, it's really tempting. It's tempting to look for magic and an iron fist and the divine rescue in our relationship with God. It's tempting because we'd all like to kind of be lifted out at any time in our life when we feel trials and tribulation and suffering. But when we're tempted like that, when we're tempted to look at our faith for magic and for an iron fist and for a divine rescue, we'll do well to remember the story of Jesus in the wilderness. Because magic and iron fists and divine rescues are not the benefits of being Christian. They are instead the temptations that we need to avoid.